Should I wait for a few more people or should I just start my introduction?
You can start.
Okay. Good morning and welcome to session 1, Life-Changing Technologies and Their Ethical Implications, IVF and CRISPR, by Clara Schreibman and Sofia Carey. My name is Eliza Locks and I will be moderating this session. Before we begin, we would like to remind you of some important logistical information. Recording. Please note that this Zoom session is being video and audio recorded. If you do not grant consent for this, please leave this meeting now. Sound. We kindly ask that you mute yourself when you are not speaking as to minimize distractions. We recommend that viewers put the screen in speaker view. If you have questions or comments during the presentation and access to chatting capability, please send them privately to me, the moderator, by selecting them in the to field of the chat box. So if you just go down to the chat box, you can change who you type it to, and then just select the one that says moderator, Eliza. Students, there may be times throughout the presentation when the presenters will ask for comments from the audience. During these times, we will not use the chat feature. Instead, either please raise your hand in front of the video to indicate that you would like to speak or come up to the D10 to share. The moderator will then call you by your name or room number, at which point you can speak to the presenters and the rest of the group. Please have your phones out to participate using the camera function to scan a QR code. There will also be a pin provided later on for a Kahoot. I will now turn the presentation over to our speakers, Clara and Sofia. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sofia and I am in 10th grade.
Hello, I'm Clara and I'm also a sophomore. Welcome to our symposium presentation on life-changing technologies and their ethical implications. We will be exploring 2 life-creating technologies:
in vitro fertilization,
abbreviated as IVF,
and clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats,
abbreviated as CRISPR or CRISPR.
50 years ago, IVF was a revolutionary technology with enormous promise for people with infertility challenges. Today, it has fulfilled this promise, but according to Clara's research, primarily for white people with economic and other means to afford it. Similarly, CRISPR is a revolutionary technology with enormous promise for people with hereditary diseases.
However, it seems that the cost of CRISPR may also be significant. This suggests that without substantial insurance and government support, CRISPR too might be utilized primarily by white people. This is despite the fact that, as with fertility, there is a great need. And when it comes to things like sickle cell disease, there is an even greater need to ensure that CRISPR is available to people of African American or other descent who need relief from devastating conditions. Our presentation focuses on the intersections or common themes between the justice issues that are raised by the use of CRISPR and the justice issues that arise with the use of IVF. The question that frames our presentation is: what are the ethical implications of limited access to life-creating and altering technologies? As you will hear in our presentation, people of lower socioeconomic statuses and members of certain minority groups often have little or even no access to these groundbreaking technologies.
A follow-up question is, should everyone have equal access to life-creating and altering technologies?
To start off, I want to cover what is IVF. In vitro fertilization refers to fertilizing an egg in a laboratory setting outside of the human body to create a human embryo. This begins with collection, washing, and storing of sperm. Next comes harvesting eggs, where ovaries are stimulated by injected medication and eggs are removed in an operating setting. Egg and sperm are then combined in a laboratory setting, and embryos are grown and tested for genetic abnormalities and then frozen. The uterus is prepared for implantation of embryos in a sterile setting. This involves a large and highly trained team of embryologists, andrologists, doctors, and nurses. After the embryo has been implanted, patients are required to come to daily ultrasounds for weeks at a time. As you can tell, IVF is a sophisticated, intense process that may require a patient to undergo and recover from anesthesia twice. Like the title of our presentation suggests, IVF is a completely life-changing technology. This is a viral video posted by the Coastal Fertility Center in Irvine, California. The video depicts Dr. Werlin making a phone call to two newly expectant parents, Carly and Nima, who had undergone in vitro fertilization.
Nima,
Yes,
where's your girl?
he's right here.
Get her on the line, buddy.
Here.
Are you there, Carly?
Yeah, I'm here, doctor.
You're pregnant! Oh, congratulations!
Oh my goodness, thank you so much. Oh my God.
Congratulations, you guys.
Clearly, from the shrieks of excitement in that TikTok, when IVF is successful, many lives are changed. Please scan this QR code with your phone and ask yourself, do you think that all people who want biological children but cannot conceive them in the conventional way have access to IVF? If you are unsure how to scan, please open your phone app, your camera app on your phone, and click the link that pops up on your screen. Once you answer the first poll, select Next at the top of your phone and select the next option to the poll. Before I started my research, I didn't know that African American women have 2 times the rate of infertility when compared to white women of the same age and socioeconomic status. This can be caused by many factors that contribute to infertility or difficulty conceiving. Some factors are biological and others are linked to socioeconomic status, which can often be a result of systemic racism. The next poll that was posed was, out of a study of 2,000 women in the late 1990s, what percentage of IVF patients were white women? 20%, 50%, 70%, or 90%? It was actually 91.5%. Here is the population in the United States by race. Despite making up 13% of the population, African Americans only make up 3% of IVF patients. These statistics highlight serious disparities in access to infertility treatment. To understand the complexity of these disparities, we first need to acknowledge the importance of reproduction and consider how the legal system has treated the concerns of people with fertility challenges. Please turn to someone next to you or think about it to yourself and discuss, do you think that infertility is a disability, and what makes someone disabled? Social and legal views of infertility changes and evolves over time. For the past 2 decades, the US Supreme Court has recognized the importance of reproduction, and infertility challenges are now understood to be a primary bodily system dysfunction and a form of disability or disease that hinders quality of life in significant ways. Infertility challenges can be detrimental and can be deemed comparable to blindness, epilepsy, and deafness in a court case with the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, prohibiting discrimination against people living with HIV. Infertility can be detrimental to an individual's, couple's, or family's overall health, social status, and stability, and has been shown to increase rates of anxiety, depression, social isolation, and rates of suicide. Though IVF is not a cure for these conditions, lack is a main contributor, and improving access and utilization is vital. The right of reproduction's history. Reproductive capability has not always been legally validated and protected by the United States and other countries. During just prior to World War II, the Third Reich sterilized millions of people who the government did not want to be able to reproduce. In the past, several states in the US have also engaged in sterilization of people. In Buck versus Bell, the United States Supreme Court in Virginia upheld involuntary sterilization of people with certain mental disabilities. However, in Skinner versus Oklahoma, Oklahoma ruled that forced sterilization of habitual inmates is unconstitutional. The court noted that reproduction is one of the basic civil rights of man, fundamental to the very survival of humanity. In years since the Skinner case, the Supreme Court has become sympathetic to people with reproductive challenges. In 2011, the World Health Organization reinforced the court's sentiment, saying infertility generates an impairment of function and thus access to healthcare falls under the Convention of Rights with Persons with Disability. The majority of patients who undergo IVF in the US pay out of pocket. This means that their health insurance, if they have health insurance, does not pay for their IVF procedure. This is often because citizens lack health insurance or their insurance policies do not include fertility care, cover infertility diagnosis only, or exclude in vitro fertilization. In states that require insurance companies to pay for IVF treatments, more people use these services that are designed to help infertility challenges. States like Massachusetts, Connecticut, Illinois, Maryland, New Jersey, and Rhode Island all provide near comprehensive coverage for infertility treatment because the law requires it. These states have higher utilization rates, and IVF is significantly cheaper in these areas. On average, including medications, a single cycle of IVF is $19,200. Most patients go through 6 cycles of IVF to reach pregnancy. What do you think of that? Do you think that that is fair or just? What if $19,200 is so much money that it keeps people of lower socioeconomic statuses from being able to use IVF? Would that change your view on how fair or just the price is?
The average cost of one CRISPR infusion to cure spinal muscular atrophy, which is a common gene edit, is $2.1 million. But as you can see, CRISPR prices can greatly vary.
This is a poll question asking you, what do you think is an effect of these high prices?
Please type in any terms that come to mind when you think of how expensive groundbreaking technology is and can be. Thank you for sharing, everyone. I'm noticing that access and lack are the most prominent answers. Now, I would like to invite you to change gears with me and consider CRISPR technology. What is CRISPR? CRISPR stands for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Short Palindromic Repeat. CRISPR locates the defective gene in a person's DNA and it cuts it out. It is a relatively new technology that was first used to edit humans in 2008. CRISPR comes from a genome editing bacteria that is naturally made. It can change and alter DNA or deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA holds detailed instructions that can be passed down by generations only with small mutations. There are 4 bases, which are the codes that store all of the genetic information and make the structure of DNA. Adenine with thymine and cytosine with guanine, or ANT and CNG base pairs. CRISPR can take one strand of DNA and edit it by removing the base pair or editing the pattern of the pairs, and doing this can prevent a disease in that individual. As you can see in this image, the scissors, which acts as CRISPR, is able to cut out a strand of DNA and either completely delete it or edit and reinsert it, and this can be a cure to a disease. I'm focusing most of my research on CRISPR edits on humans, but it can also be used to edit egg and sperm cells, which are also known as germline or reproductive cells. Editing germline cells affects traits that are passed down to future generations. CRISPR can also be performed on an embryo before it develops into a fetus. Currently, the laws put strict limits on when reproductive cells and embryos can undergo CRISPR and how long the edited cells can develop before they must be destroyed, which is 3 days currently. CRISPR is not supposed to be performed on people except in the context of clinical trials. The specific trials I researched are leukemia, sickle cell disease, which is very similar to beta thalassemia, eye disease, and edits of embryos. I specifically researched sickle cell disease, which is what I will be speaking about today. But in order to be in a clinical trial, a doctor has to recommend the patient as a possible candidate. Then it is up to the patient to decide if they want to take the risk and be part of the clinical trial. As I previously mentioned, all these trials have an average cost of $2.1 million per usage, but CRISPR trials can even range from $50,000 to $5 billion. Here is an interesting fact or question I have thought about while researching, and I want to hear what you all think. If you were offered to be the first person in a clinical trial while having a life-threatening disease, would you join the trial? Please scan this code and select a response. Wow. Thank you for sharing. Sickle cell disease is a mutation of hemoglobin in the blood. When a baby is in utero, they have a different hemoglobin. As soon as the child takes their first breath after birth, the cells switch to adult hemoglobin, quickly becoming the issue. Patients have described the feeling of sickle cell as pain and burning everywhere blood flows. To survive, many patients need bone marrow transplants, and even then, this may not work. Scientists are using CRISPR to edit their somatic cells so they do not switch from fetal hemoglobin to adult hemoglobin. Sickle cell disease is a disease that people in the United States commonly think of primarily affecting African American people. 1 in every 365 African American babies are born with sickle cell disease, and 1 in every 13 African American babies are born with the trait. These statistics show that it is not a really rare disease, and it does affect many individuals. There are many justice issues involved in sickle cell disease because of the commonality of it in African American people, the disparity of minorities in clinical trials, and the need for a cure to this disease immediately. Other than bone marrow transplants, which are just treatments, and there are always a risk, there is no cure for this disease, which reveals the urgency of CRISPR becoming a treatment. Going back to the poll I just asked you to fill out, let's talk about a real life example of someone whose life was transformed by a successful CRISPR treatment. Meet Victoria Gray. She is 34 years old, and she was the first person to receive CRISPR in a sickle cell disease clinical trial. In an interview, it was stated that the sickle cell disease clinical trial was opened and no one joined it yet. Victoria knew that this cure was never tested on humans and it was not fully determined that it would work, but Victoria signed up without hesitation. This shows that she was willing to take the risk to rid this terrible disease and how important it is to have minorities and all people in clinical trials. Here's a video to speak a little bit about Victoria.
In order to insert those edited genes, doctors actually have to rely on a therapy you probably know for cancer, chemotherapy.
After they are gene edited, we have to use chemotherapy to remove the cells that make sickle cell disease in the patient before replacing them with the gene edited cells.
All of this was just a theory until Dr. Frangul was given approval to actually test it out in a patient. The very first was Victoria Gray.
Then when we told her about this new technology and said, look, nobody else has ever done it before, nobody has tried it, we don't know if it's going to work. We don't know the long-term side effects of it. And when we discussed it with her, she said, sign me up.
That was back in 2019. About a year and a half later, her sickle cell anemia has dramatically reduced, and she's getting to do things she assumed were impossible.
The thing that made me the happiest is to see Victoria saying she can now go and attend her children's sporting activities, which she could not do before because she is in pain all the time.
This same technology may be able to treat other genetic disorders, meaning additional books about medical miracles may begin in Music City too.
We are very proud and very happy to be part of this, really a breakthrough in medicine that we are doing here in Nashville.
Even though CRISPR was successful for Victoria Gray, which is amazing, it is still a new technology that will require even more minority participants than it already has had in order for it to leave the clinical trial stage. I believe that scientists should put the majority of CRISPR focus on sickle cell disease clinical trials because of the recent success it has had, as well as that it primarily affects minorities. So scientists have to encourage and promote clinical trials to gain minority participants.
In order to insert
A common debate is whether or not people should even be allowed to join potentially dangerous trials. What do you think? Now that we have covered the background of two groundbreaking technologies, we must explore the ethical implications of IVF and CRISPR in use.
We will be examining these implications through the consequentialist framework, and we'll be using the values of responsibility, autonomy, safety, and justice to address the disparities that occur when revolutionary technologies that can create or transform life are not broadly available to anyone that might need them. And what are the ethical responsibilities as a society to people in need?
As we move forward in this presentation, we want to challenge you to get in the mindset of someone who desperately wants a biological child or wants their child to be rid of sickle cell disease but lack the means to do so. The first value we considered is justice.
There are significant justice issues that form in regional, ethnic, and racial disparities in access to the technologies we researched. Economic barriers are significant, but it might surprise you to know that they are not the only barrier. Researchers have found that communication differences, cultural stigmas, and prior bad experiences with the US medical system can keep many from accessing infertility treatments like IVF.
After studies such as the Tuskegee syphilis study, where hundreds of African American men with syphilis were studied throughout the evolution of their disease and were never treated of their condition, many African American people have lost their trust in scientists, and that is understandable. In CRISPR clinical trials, less than 20% of participants are African American people or people of color, and these statistics are pretty similar with all trials.
Another barrier to justice in access has been based on language. Language differences have discouraged non-English speaking patients from seeking needed medical care. Physicians have also been recorded to consciously or subconsciously make assumptions or biases about who deserves to be a parent and use IVF and who does not. This may deter doctors from treating infertility. The time burden of IVF also discourages many from seeking treatment. For IVF, substantial time off work for repeated office visits and travel to medical facilities that may be geographically distant is common. Many treatments require the ability to follow complicated medical instructions, and people of lower socioeconomic groups are unable to take time off work for the needed medical treatment. There is an unequal distribution of obstetrician gynecologists and IVF centers, making infertility treatment inaccessible to many. The map shows the highest amount of IVF centers in dark green. They are found in states with mandated IVF insurances and high medium incomes. The geographic areas disproportionately affect minority communities. Do you think that just because people live far away from an IVF center means that they don't deserve to have biological children?
Because CRISPR is still a clinical trial, it is not known if there will be location constraints, but there are significant racial disparities in clinical trial participation, even though many of the current trials involve research on conditions affecting communities of color. A recent study showed that out of 150,000 patients in 29 different countries tested, 86% of the population of participants were white. Scientists gain a significant amount of more information on white people than on African American people during clinical trials. Without this information on people of color, scientists are not sure if their bodies will react the same as white people. It is crucial for scientists to be more effective in their outreach to communities of color in order to educate people about clinical trials and reduce the stigma of clinical trials.
It would also be beneficial to grow diversity in the medical field to gain trust in patients. Research has been shown that when doctors are the same race as their patient, it creates a sense of trust.
The next value we evaluated is autonomy.
Access to IVF highlights a conflict between personal autonomy, the desire and ability to conceive a biological child, and justice, whether society should help pay for this autonomy. In the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, they recognize the obligation to not obstruct the fundamental right of reproduction in its decision to overturn Costa Rica's ban of in vitro fertilization. Costa Rica overturned the 12-year ban because the court found that citizens' right to enjoy reproductive autonomy and create a family outweighed non-implanted embryos' interests. When valuing autonomy, the government or healthcare providers should have no part in obstructing one's right and autonomy to infertility services.
In CRISPR trials, autonomy is vital. There are no people being forced into entering the trial. Additionally, if they're eligible, there are no doctors excluding them from the trial. People have the autonomy to choose to use CRISPR if they would like to. There is a high risk that CRISPR may not work correctly, so no one is forced to join. With that said, prior to the trial, scientists must inform the patient of the details and risks, so even if the trial was not successful and it put the patient in harm's way, the patients did give informed consent.
The next value we will be exploring is safety.
Additional research is required to determine the short-term and long-term safety of CRISPR in humans. Safety is a significant ethical value because CRISPR usage depends on how consistent it is and if it will help or harm the person. Scientists and doctors have the duty of protecting people from harm, but it can be challenging for scientists to predict if their genes will connect properly. CRISPR will not be able to leave clinical trials until the effectiveness and consistency is accurate a high percentage of the time. People do not want to put themselves in harm's way unless it is absolutely necessary. However, a lot of the time, the clinical trial participants have a terminal or excruciatingly painful disease. It may be critical to use to save their lives. Though CRISPR may be highly dangerous, it can extend life expectancies in some cases, like Victoria Gray's. Safety ties in with fairness. It may not be entirely safe for a patient to participate in a CRISPR clinical trial because of the safety concerns, but it would not be fair if they were not allowed to participate and they have a life-threatening disease. It is hard to know whether or not CRISPR is worth the risk to take, but it is important to consider that all people have their own right to autonomy.
Some people suggest that IVF hinders safety of future children. This is a concern for many. A 2002 New England medical study found that the use of IVF appears to roughly double the risk of having a low birth rate or a child with significant disabilities. Lasting effects of premature births include cerebral palsy, impaired learning, vision, and hearing, behavioral and psychological problems, and chronic health issues. These effects have lifelong costs. African American women have an even higher risk of premature births, mainly due to increased obesity rates in communities of color. IVF patients should be aware of these risks, but the risk should not deter the need for access. Risk to childhood cancer is also dramatically higher in children born via IVF, according to a Danish study. This raises more questions about the increased health costs for children born through IVF. How do we address these ethical dilemmas associated with IVF? How do we balance the value of life against the concern for safety of the person who is conceived through IVF? How should the state recognize such harm to a child if the child would not exist without in vitro fertilization?
We will now ask you to scan this poll. What do you value more? Safety, autonomy, or equality in these situations?
Please just scan this code and rank the values. Thank you for sharing.
The final value we explored is responsibility. CRISPR can save a life, but it is expensive. So as of right now, only wealthy people can use the tool after clinical trials.
IVF can create a life, but it too is mainly accessed by wealthy people.
It seems unjust that only a select group of people can use CRISPR or IVF, so I believe that it will be necessary for policymakers, insurance providers, doctors, scientists, and all other stakeholders to find ways to minimize groundbreaking technology's prices.
When valuing responsibility, many questions arise. If IVF doesn't work, should the patient still pay? Who pays for CRISPR trials if they are unsuccessful and patients' health is at risk?
Is the government responsible to ensure health to people of all races and socioeconomic statuses? Are IVF and CRISPR really necessary?
Before we go on to our next poll question, let's compare how IVF is paid for worldwide. According to the European Society of Human Reproduction and Embryology, IVF accounts for approximately 1.5% of births in the US. IVF accounts for approximately 3% of births in Europe and 5.9% in Denmark, 4% in Belgium, and 3.5% in Sweden. From the study, we can conclude that infertility is gone underutilized in the US. Clearly, when a state subsidizes the treatment, barriers to equality lessen.
Who do you think is responsible for paying to use these groundbreaking technologies? Please scan these codes and remember these are anonymous.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing. It's definitely a difficult question to answer, but I noticed that our community has a lot of the similar responses.
Let me just reload it. Wow. Okay.
Very interesting.
So everyone, thank you for sharing. So now I'm going to pull up a Kahoot. And please go on to kahoot.it. Sorry about that. The game code will load shortly. Please type in 321-5037 to join the poll. And remember, your answers will be completely anonymous.
Yeah, this is a poll and not a race, so don't worry about answering quickly.
We will just wait for a couple more seconds to begin. Okay, we will start now. Do you think IVF should be government subsidized?
Yes, no, or maybe.
Do you think CRISPR should be illegal? Do you think the medical field has changed since the introduction of IVF and now with the use of CRISPR? Do you think the government should be held responsible for lessening these barriers for increasing accessibility? Which stakeholders do you think are affected most by these disparities? Last question. After this presentation, what is next for you?
Thank you all for participating in that Kahoot.
So thank you all so much for coming to our symposium presentation. We appreciate all of your participation and we hope you learned something new.
If there are any questions, please feel free to ask them now.
Yeah, thank you guys. I learned a lot from your presentation. Sorry, I'll turn on my camera. Yeah, so we have time for a brief Q&A. So if you have a question or comment, please feel free to raise your hand or come up to the D10 and we can call on you, but you can also private message me in the chat box. I received one question, so 1 second, I can ask that. I don't know if I'm supposed to do this anonymously or what, but someone asked, to what extent do people really have autonomy, considering that doctors inform the patients of these trials are ones that would gain research data? So talking about like the doctor's influence in the autonomy of choosing whether or not to be part of something like this.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I mentioned this before. Yes, the doctors are benefiting from the data, but the doctors as of right now are not forcing people to join. So it is up to the patient if they would like to join. And also it does benefit the patient if it works, and it will also benefit the society in the future if it's going to be a safe technology to use.
I see a question. I think it's Catherine on the D10.
Yes. Okay, my question is, what are some strategies for increasing IVF or CRISPR access?
So some major ways to increase access would be having multilingual staff and interpreters in the medical field and diversifying the medical field, having anti-bias and cultural competence training, also having a public education system and like reaching underserved populations, talking about infertility challenges, greater insurance coverages and paid leave for people who want to access IVF would all be beneficial in increasing the accessibility of the technology.
For CRISPR, I would say other than growing the medical field, so there's more research done to cut costs, and diversifying the medical field to gain trust of minorities, educating communities about clinical trials is really important to reduce the stigma of trials in order to gain more growth in clinical trials to gain access in the future.
Thank you, Catherine, for your question.
Okay, I'd say we have time for one more question. So someone said, what made you want to research this topic?
I would say for me, I remember there being a lot of twins in my predominantly white middle school, and this always just made me question if the use of IVF was as common in other areas. And I think that like started the passion, just like the interest in the justice issues around fertility treatments.
Yeah, in 8th grade, I learned about genetics and gene editing, and I already knew that this was something I would be interested in conducting research on in the future. And as I began my research, I noticed that there were disparities in accessibility, and this caused me to do my bioethics project on that.
And yeah, we just saw some connections between that, so we decided we worked together.
Thank you so much.
Okay, maybe we can do one more. I just got another question. The next session starts at 10:50. Oh, okay, gotcha. So they gave us like a few extra minutes because we started a little bit late. Oh, I see a question. Okay, the D10, they're waving. Yeah, you guys can go.
Unmute. So I have a question about what would be the ethical implications if BIPOC communities were the majority for CRISPR trials? Do you think there's a potential for them to be used as like human guinea pigs again?
That's
Yeah,
similar to the other question, so it works.
Oh, okay. That's a really great question. We did not research that, but I would say that our world has modernized, and it would be really unfortunate and terrible if human guinea pigs would happen again. But I think that we as a community and country have grown, and we hope that it won't happen again.
Okay, are there any other D10s that have questions? Oh yeah, go ahead. In 239.
Do these same disparities and injustices with these types of technologies occur in other countries besides America?
I mentioned this briefly in my presentation, but IVF is utilized much higher in Europe, so this may hint to better accessibility, though the justice issues do pertain in other countries too.
Yeah, I would say I also said this in the part about CRISPR, that out of 150,000 people, 29 different countries tested, 86% of the participants were white. So that means that this is a large-scale global issue that needs to be solved, and it's probably a much more difficult dilemma than many people have thought.
Thank you, Tara, for your question.
Okay, D10, 122. I think it's Audrey.
Hi, so my question is about CRISPR. So what do you think, if it were to become more accessible, would be the extent of which it would become kind of like abused for more than just medical purposes, like designer babies, and like how can that be prevented, or do you think that it should be prevented?
Yeah, so I did most of my research on somatic cell edits, so that means just like edits of living humans. And embryo edits are pretty new still, so there's not as much, success in that. But with that said, I don't think that people should misuse CRISPR, and I think that my personal opinion is I don't really think that people should use CRISPR for visual effects. I think it should be something to benefit the people, like to eliminate cancers and other diseases that are life-threatening. Thank you for the question.
Okay, I don't see any more questions, and we have 7 minutes till the next one starts. Actually, wait, there's one more in the chat. Someone asked, would you think genetic diversity would be an issue in the future if IVF isn't offered in all diverse communities?
I definitely think that could be another consequence if many communities don't have access to have biological children. I think many are either forced to adopt or just not have children. So I think having this ability only able to like white people or wealthy people definitely can cause issues with diversity in the future, though we don't have research that shows that yet, but hopefully the issues will be solved or helped before we can see anything like that happen.
Great. So yeah, thank everyone. Thank you so much for coming. If you saw in the chat box, I put the links to the next session. So you can either stay here to see Sofia and Jordan's Balancing Profit and People, a deeper dive into ethics of the pharmaceutical industry, or click the associated links in the chat box for the other sessions. You have 6 minutes till the next one starts. So if anyone wants to hang around and ask a few more questions, you probably can, but we also need a little bit of, transition time in between. So thank you all so much.